Ladies and gentlemen, it's been 2 months. I've got a ton of requests to revisit the artifact video and give a more detailed ranking of artifacts, particularly when it comes to what star level you need them at. You need 3-star, 4-star, 5-star, or the coveted 6-star for these artifacts. So this is going to be your definitive guide for the month of July. Now, I've already done a lot of the work for this artifact tier list because, thankfully, with over 120 artifacts, most of them have not changed. So that is something you can breathe easy about. Most of your artifact knowledge, if you watched the last video back in April, has not changed whatsoever. As you can see here, we have 2 rankings at the bottom, which fill out the majority of artifacts in the game. I've reworded them a little bit to be a little bit nicer, but essentially you have the low impact artifacts, and then you have the decent artifacts. And I'll go through and explain what these are now before going through to everything else. So low impact artifacts, although they can be for characters that can be useful in certain pieces of content, like for example, Doctor Strange, Riri Williams, Ghost Panther, these artifacts are either on characters that are very weak, in the case of Caecilius, Angela, for now, Vulture, etc., or they're on characters, like I said, Doctor Strange, Ghost Panther, who have value themselves. The character is good, but the artifact does not do anything for them. The second tier of artifact here, decent, are basically artifacts that are either good for the character or the character themselves is good and the artifact does something to enhance them in a meaningful way, but it's not a must-have. You don't absolutely, need it for the character to function whatsoever. It just enhances a little bit of the character. And there's actually a couple of mistakes here, so I will fix that as we move on through the tier list. And then for support artifacts, it's very straightforward. These are artifacts that will give a buff of some sort to either all allies or a specific faction of allies. So you have Warriors of the Sky allies, Flame Ability allies, Gamma Radiation allies, Spider Sense allies, and symbiote allies, and then I think everything else is all allies, or maybe that's villain allies, but a wider range of things. So yeah, all of these support artifacts, very, very good up until about maybe Sunbird. After Sunbird, they're not really that valuable, but certainly the top 3, the top 5 are very, very useful for a bunch of content, mostly PvE, but Agent Venoms has quite a bit of use in PvP, as does Scarlet Spiders for the Spider-Verse characters. So yeah, with that being said, that is sort of the bulk of the list that you can kind of ignore. Now we're going to get to the artifacts where they sort of need the artifact at either 3 or 4 stars, which is pretty self-explanatory. They need the artifact at 5 or 6 stars, so you want to aim for the higher one there. And then we have the last one, which is meta. Now, meta is pretty straightforward because there are characters who are meta for content, and they don't need their artifact to continue to be meta for said content. So, for example, Spider-Gwen. Spider-Gwen's a great example, and I'll get her out of the way here. You don't need her artifact at all. That's basically what this means. She can do most of the content that she does already without her artifact in any way, shape, or form. So these may be the best characters to invest in, particularly if you do not want to fiddle with artifacts and sort of, have to deal with it. But, I will put Iron Man here as well. His artifact is great for enhancing his PvE value, but it does not unlock anything that you absolutely need in any way, shape, or form. All right, with that being said, let's kick off the list with the 3 to 4 star artifacts. So for these ones, we're going to drag in characters that are not necessarily as good, but it's going to provide a vital function to their performance. Characters like Destroyer and Absorbing Man. In the past, they were on a PvP artifact ranking, but essentially what these artifacts do is they heal the character based on how much they reflect, and that's useful in sort of any amount. Similarly, with someone like Green Goblin, getting attack is just more useful. I would say he sort of needs his artifact to push higher in ABX, which is his primary game mode. But you can settle for a 3 or 4 star version of the artifact. Cleaning up a couple of mistakes from earlier in the video, we're going to move Moon Knight up to needs artifact. We're also going to move Colossus up to needs artifact, but they're only going to need it in the 3 or 4 star variety. Colossus gives him a heal. Moon Knight enhances his ABX and ABL value. But these ones, again, while they scale very, very well with tier 4, they are not necessarily needed at a very high level in order for Moon Knight to do what he does best, and in order for Colossus to get a little bit of healing. The healing honestly doesn't scale very well as well from 3 stars all the way up to 6 stars. That is another thing to consider with these artifacts. I can't mention it for every single one, but some artifacts have really good scaling, whereas other artifacts don't really have a good scaling. A good example of that would be Spider-Man's artifact, as well as Miles Morales' artifact. Now, Miles Morales doesn't really need his artifact because it's a PvP effect, and he doesn't really have much value for PvP. But Spider-Man has a ton of value for PvP, as does, not ton, but Black Widow has more value for PvP now that she's been squarely knocked out of PvE stuff. But they all have the same artifact, the sort of infinite dodge. Although it's very, very powerful at 5 and 6 stars, and I can certainly see some people argue that Spider-Man needs it at 5 or 6 stars, I think he can certainly get by with it at 3 or 4 stars because the scaling isn't that crazy, right? 3-star gives you 10% chance, 6-star gives you 20. So it is double, but that's all the way from the lowest to the highest, right? So if you're able to get your hands on a 4-star version, I think that 10% goes up to, I think, 14. So you already, more than halfway there to 20, and the scaling just doesn't make that much of a difference compared to some other artifacts. Again, another character that I think the scaling doesn't matter that insanely for is Adam Warlock. He certainly needs his artifact, but I don't think that... more healing is always better, for sure, and that's the case with all these artifacts, but I think as long as you have some form of healing for Adam, it's going to make a huge difference in his PvP performance. Black Bolt is another good example of a meta character who doesn't need their artifact to function in high-level meta content. Blue Dragon certainly needs her artifact, but not at a high level as long as you have something there so she can deal increased damage to supervillains. Carnage certainly needs his artifact, and this is where I think it's going to get into a little bit of a hazy territory. I think for Carnage, he probably needs the 5 or 6-star version. He's going to need as many seconds as possible on his artifact, whereas when we get to some of the other artifact characters, I don't think they need it quite as badly. Dr. Octopus, I think some people could argue he needs his artifact since it enhances his ABX, ABL performance. I would say he doesn't need it. It's not something I would prioritize necessarily, despite the fact that he is meta, and it certainly enhances his qualities as a meta character, but it certainly doesn't. I'm trying to rank these, by the way, in terms of like which one I think is most useful for them. So maybe we'll put Dr. Octopus first here because it matters the most. But yeah, you can sort of take that as you think. Emma Frost here definitely needs her artifact. I would say, again, like a lot of these other characters, doesn't need it at a high level. She just needs the ability unlocked, which is the Reflect. And that's really important because it allows her to deal with a lot of targets. Otherwise, Gamora, I think, another really good example of a character who doesn't need the artifact. It certainly helps out, and she's certainly meta regardless, but it doesn't really change too much about her kit because it just gives her basic damage to enemies below 50% HP, which doesn't apply as often to ABX ABL, and then it gives her a little bit of ignore dodge. Useful for sure, but certainly not as obviously meta for the same game mode that they're meta for as someone like a Moon Knight. Gilgamesh, although he's not meta anymore, I think you certainly want his artifact if you're trying to build him up, so just be careful. Like, I'm not saying that they're on the same level, I'm just saying how you want the artifact. And with these artifacts that give HP, along with Juggernaut, the more is better, right? The more you have, the better. Really, really important there. With Hulk, speaking of HP, I don't think he needs a high-level artifact, although for him, HP, the more the better, because Hulk's artifact only gives him HP. Whereas for Gilgamesh and Juggernaut, they get HP, they get max HP, and they get a heal that procs for them. So for Hulk, I'm going to put him down here in the sort of, needs it, but he's not sort of dying for a very, very high-level artifact. Same thing goes for Gore. You basically just need the effect that it gives, which is increased damage to heroes and villains. That's always great. It scales from 10 to 20%, but it's not a necessity at a very high level for him to do well. Heimdall, another good example, certainly needs the artifact because it gives him access to healing that he otherwise wouldn't have. But for Heimdall, any healing is better than none. Hela certainly isn't meta enough to deserve an artifact above 3 or 4 stars or deserve you to worry about it. It's certainly very, very useful to give her the immortality effect, but she's not meta enough to justify it at a higher level. Same thing goes for Mr. Sinister. Immortality effect, very valuable, but again, they're not meta enough for it to really matter. Same thing goes for Sabretooth as well. All three of these don't really justify hunting for that 5 or 6 star artifact. In the case of Wolverine, although I am tempted to put him up here with Carnage, the truth is he doesn't need the full 6 to 7 seconds, which is what you're getting at a 5 to 6 star artifact. I think he can still function very well with a low level artifact. Obviously, more is better, but unlike Carnage, Wolverine has access to auto healing, so part of the effect of the artifact, which scales really well, is how much it heals you, the pop that it heals you at the end when the immortality runs out. Very important for Carnage, not really as important for Wolverine. So really for Wolverine, the only thing you're getting enhanced is the number of seconds. Thanos, another character, very, very strong on his own, doesn't really need the artifact that honestly, he doesn't really need the artifact at all. It helps him out, and he's meta regardless for a little bit of content for now. But I don't think he needs the artifact whatsoever to function. Jean, I don't think she needs the artifact to function either. It certainly helps. It's certainly useful for PvP content, but I don't think she needs it. I don't think she needs it. It just helps her out. Magic, another immortality character. I would say Magic is maybe a little bit more meta, and I think she needs it a little bit more in the 5 or 6 star because she's not very strong defensively. She doesn't have access to a lot of healing. So I think that makes a little bit more sense here. Magneto, I think any version of his artifact would be good for him. I don't think he, necessarily needs to hunt for that top spot. He's still a very meta character regardless. Makari, not so meta anymore, but because her artifact, like Moon Knight's, enhances her ABX abilities, if you want to use her for that content, she absolutely needs her artifact. But any version will do just to give you access to that effect. Namor, he's still meta, true. He basically has the same effect as Iron Man, so it's again, not something that he needs. Professor X, you'd probably need his artifact. It helps for ABX, ABL. I'm leaning towards here because he's sort of meta for ABL right now, but it's not crazy out of the park sort of meta, sort of knocking things out. It's tricky because it's very similar to Dr. Octopus for Professor X. So perhaps they should swap places. I'm not 100% sure how I feel about this, but having gotten Professor X's artifact at 4 stars and not being too happy with it, that's kind of then I should probably put him up here then, right? Yeah, I probably should put him up here. But then again, his damage, right? Like his score is really the only thing keeping him in the meta for that piece of content. So maybe he does need the artifact. This is a tricky one. This is a bit of a tricky one. I'll put him here for now. You know what? We might as well move Dr. Octopus down as well for that case, but I'll hear what you guys have to say in the comments down below because I'm a little bit confused about that one. Cersei, the higher the better here because she revives and the revive pops with an HP heal, so the more the better here. The Eternals are not in the meta, so don't get it twisted. I'm not saying these characters are meta. This is not a ranking of meta-ness, right? But it's just that the artifact itself has a more potent effect. Shadow Shell, not really in the meta anymore, and her artifact, it's not very high power, so honestly, she could go down here with Venom and Ant-Man and Cap and Sharon sort of relegated to the bottom. Storm, good artifact. I don't think she needs it. She's sort of barely hanging on to the meta right now as a female mutant hero. So I'll put her there for now. But Thor, I think I overvalued his artifact a little bit in the past. I don't think he needs it. However, I would say that having it certainly unlocks more options for him, especially in the farming department, because you can use his own leadership to enhance his lightning damage. So it's definitely very useful, but it's almost specifically useful for farming. So I wouldn't say that's a need. It's more of like a very valuable but luxury effect. These next 4 artifacts released around the same time are all very bad, so unfortunately they're all going to go into the decent. And I'm being generous at this point with these artifacts. Scorpions is probably low impact, but yeah, really disappointed recently with the value of artifacts. They have not really held up their bargain at all in terms of how impactful they're supposed to. Not the bargain, but they just haven't been good. Straight up, artifacts recently have not been good. Again, Spider-Woman's just decent. It gives her increased elemental damage. It's kind of just whatever. I haven't memorized these ones, so I have to look. It's interesting that Spider-Man 2099 gives him damage to alien and creatures, which sounds like an ABX thing, but he isn't used for ABX because it's not a requirement to use a male speed hero. So again, I don't understand why they gave him that artifact. Spot's artifact, we just got it for free. It's not bad. It gives him ignore damage, non-boss enemy damage decreases a PvP effect, so it's not bad, but it's just not that impactful. And then Star-Lord's, I think, is impactful for ABL, for sure. It's in the same ballpark as these two guys here, so we're just going to put him there in sort of the category of it certainly helps, but it's not something that you need to hunt for at a very high level because the scaling is still pretty decent. And actually, I think one of them is defensive, so it's actually not even as good as Professor X's. So yeah, with that being said, I think this accurately captures these artifacts. So just to summarize here, if you're fast forwarding to the end of the video, this is not a ranking of the best character to the worst character. I'm not trying to say that Gilgamesh is better than Wolverine. What I'm basically ranking here in the top 3 are characters that need their artifact, but they can use it at a low level. Characters that need their artifact, but more often need it at a high level because of certain conditions. And then characters who are meta and don't need their artifact to continue to be meta. You could strip them of their artifact and they would still be meta for the categories that they are already valuable for. Everybody else is very self-explanatory. Those support artifacts, those are decent, and those are low impact. For the most part, the artifacts are ranked from most useful in its own category to least useful in its own category. So do keep that in mind. There is a massive, massive gap between Carnage's artifact and Gilgamesh's artifact, at least in terms of how good those characters are right now. That's been Alex. Thanks so much for watching. Never going to say that. That's been Alex shit again. Smash the like button if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.